Welcome everyone. I'm going to be presenting a talk on a type of journal called predatory journals, and I've entitled my talk Ruining Scientific Credibility Since 2008-ish. My name's Matthew Schmidt. I'm an associate professor at the University of Florida in educational technology. I'm also a faculty member in the Institute for Advanced Learning Technologies. Got some information here if you'd like to learn a little bit more about me, or if you'd like to tweet me up on Twitter. I've got my Twitter handle there as well. In the Institute for Advanced Learning Technologies, I run the Advanced Learning Technologies Studio, and this is a learning design studio, or rather a learning experience design studio that I direct, where we build some really cool stuff. We have built a number of interventions in the studio. The one on the left is an intervention that focuses on helping youth with type 1 diabetes to manage their insulin. And on the right, you can see a virtual reality piece of virtual reality software that we're developing for autistic adults. And I'd be happy to provide details if you're interested in learning more about that. But that is not the focus of my talk today. So what do? I design, develop, implement, and evaluate advanced technology interventions with a particular focus on individuals with disabilities, lifelong medical conditions, and their caregivers and families. So how did I end up here giving a talk to your class tonight? Well, it all started with a Facebook post that I made because I noticed that someone had published something in IGI Global. And I'll talk a little bit about what IGI Global is in a minute. But I had become increasingly frustrated with this publisher because anytime I tried to retrieve anything from IGI Global when I was doing research, I would run into a paywall. And now I work at the University of Florida, and we have a fairly robust journal article licensing and subscription service through our libraries that's available online. And yet still, nearly every single IGI Global publication, I would hit this paywall where I would be expected to pay $30 to $100 for any chapter or article that I ran into. And that seems preposterous when I'm able to find so many other journal articles from so many other publishers, Springer, Elsevier, etc., that are licensed through our library. And it just struck me that, it's just a paywall with extra steps. It is not necessarily an academic publisher because they're not necessarily interested in sharing their findings. They want to hide them behind a paywall because they want you to pay. So I posted this up on Facebook, rather glib, right? I was in a saucy mood and wanted to put out some hot takes. So I threw this one up there. And George Valencianos, who is a certified super smart dude in our field, wrote back, and he had some comments about it. And the comment that really resonated with me was when he mentioned that, you can see I have it kind of highlighted here in pink, young people give him hope for the future, but they're facing a landscape in which institutional pressures to publish, along with the promise of a scarce and secure position in academia, enable predatory publishers to potentially exploit them. So what does this mean? And I expect because many of you are new students, you might be asking the same thing. Well, how can I be exploited? What is this notion of a predatory journal? And we're going to get to that. So my Facebook post led to Dr. Tom Reeves, Professor Emeritus at the University of Georgia, sending me a direct message, and I'll read it to you. He said, "Rogue book publishers also want to make money, even if what they produce does not forward science one iota. For instance, the publisher IGI Global specializes in publishing large edited collections. They press a few dozen copies that cost maybe 500 euros each. 500 euros for a single copy of a single edited volume." All right. He continues, The idea seems to be that the editor of the book, a researcher craving more academic merits, gets a nice item to add to the publication list, while the publisher draws money from selling a few mandatory library copies. Ultimately, the public pays the salaries of these questionable publishers. While those sections of the public truly in need of good edited collections, such as scholars from low and middle income countries who can't afford access to many journals, stand to benefit nothing. Nor is the book likely to have any impact whatsoever on scientific development. Wow, that's a scathing review of this publisher. So, who is IGI Global? Well, here is a screenshot of their webpage, which appears to be stuck in around 2007. But that aside, IGI Global has a large variety of published work that they provide through their website and that they index through a number of platforms. You'll also find publications by IGI Global when you're scouring various articles that you're reading as you advance through your PhD program, because they tend to publish a great deal in the area of educational technology. Now here's the thing. IGI Global is really good at what they do, and they are able to solicit scholars who are willing to edit edited volumes for them, and then those scholars go ahead and they will ask others to submit book chapters to these edited volumes. And I am someone who has submitted 3 book chapters or contributed to 3 book chapters that were published in IGI volumes. And you can see those 3 here. So yes, I have absolutely published in what some might consider to be a rogue or a predatory publisher. So mea culpa, right? Now, predatory publishing is so pervasive that there is actually a meme page on the internet dedicated to predatory scientific publishers. I'm going to share some of these with you. So here we've got an "it" meme. Do you have a manuscript? I'll float your article in no time. So I want you to think a little bit about that. Fast publication is a hallmark of predatory publishing. Or, thanks for submitting your manuscript. Your article publishing fee, please. So another aspect of predatory journals is that they often charge the author to publish their journal article. Now there are reputable journals that also charge the author, but this is because those journals are open access. There's a difference between a predatory open access journal and a legitimate open access journal, though. When you receive an invitation to submit your manuscript to a predatory journal, and we've got the free hugs here. This one I think is just going for the LOLs. And then finally, that article we submitted a week ago was published online. Fool! That was a predatory journal. Well, I don't want you guys to end up like poor Robin getting smacked by old Batman here. So on this basis, I put together another Facebook post. In the last few weeks, I've been invited to publish my research in many journals, and I called a couple of them out, and I'm frankly fed up. How can novice researchers hoping to build their CV avoid wasting their time and effort with these shady so-called journals? Are we teaching our grad students to spot the red flags? So that is what I'm here to do today. I am going to provide you with details on how you can spot red flags and hopefully avoid publishing in predatory journals. And I'm going to end on a cautionary note. And it was on that note that I fell down a rabbit hole and began to read much more about this phenomenon of predatory journals, predatory publishing, faux open access, and so on. And you'll learn later that I had some skin in this game, and you'll learn why. But I want to point to an article that was given to me by Dr. Reeves, which I found to be particularly enlightening. And it is also very well researched and very well supported with lots and lots of great citations that if you decide to go down this rabbit hole, this is a great place to start. But first, let's play a game, shall we? This game is called Spot the Credible Journal. All right, let's get started. Are you guys ready? Are you with me? I want you to pull out your chat and let me know if you're ready to go. Are you as excited as SpongeBob right now? All right, Mohammed, I'm with you. I see that one. He's on it. All right, Denise. Betsy, Allison, excellent. Okay, we're going to spot the credible journal. All right, let's do this. 3 of these are predatory and 1 is not. I want you to spot it, but don't give me your answer yet. Wait until we go through all the criteria for spotting the journal, and then we're going to do a survey and see which one is not predatory. All right, let's do it. So the first one, International Journal of Education. The next one, International Journal of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences. The next one, International Journal of Business and Management Studies. And finally, the International Journal of Higher Education. So here we've got our 4 contenders for our epic game of the evening. All right, now I'm going to give you the rules of the game. You're going to need to evaluate each one of those journal articles against these criteria that I'm going to give you. So in most cases, you will be able to figure out if this journal is predatory by just answering 2 or 3 of these questions. However, you need to understand all of these questions because they're going to give you more assurance. And in addition to that, it's going to give you a better understanding and a more nuanced understanding of what to be looking for and what to look out for when you are trying to find a journal to publish your own research, or when you're trying to find a journal that is publishing research that you want to cite, that you want to read. All right, so here on the right-hand side, we've got our 4 journals. And on the left-hand side, we have the first criterion. Have you read anything from these journals or heard of them from colleagues in your class? Give that some thought. Take a look at those journal articles and think, do I know any of these journal articles? And it's okay if you don't. You are, if I understand correctly, many of you might be in your first year of a PhD program. And so you may not be super familiar with all the journals in the field, and that's okay. If you don't know the answer to this, there's plenty of other questions that you can use to determine if this may or may not be predatory. All right, on to the next one. Are these journals ranked in SkyMago or Cabell's, or is it SkyMago? I don't know how to pronounce that. But there are there's 2 links here. Each one of these is a service online that provides information about reputable publishers. Not all journals end up in these indexing services. So there are some journals that are reputable that are not listed in SkyMago, whatever that name is, SkyMago and Cabell's. And then there are of course journals that are listed there and that provide lots and lots of metrics and details. So you're encouraged to look up journals on these websites in order to determine if they are truly reputable. But you need to understand that if you don't find them on there, that doesn't mean that they're not reputable. It only means that they're not published on these sites. So it can be a red flag, but it's not necessarily a red flag. All right, on to the next one. Do any of these journals have the word international in their title? That's not a good look. But to be fair and to be perfectly honest, there are many very good international journals. I'm thinking right now, I just published a journal, an article in the International Journal of Human-Computer Interaction. It's a fine journal. There's nothing wrong with an international journal, but the problem is that international word has really got a lot of baggage behind it anymore. So be careful. There's another potential red flag, but not necessarily a red flag. All right, next question. Is the peer review and publication turnaround for many or for these articles unreasonably short? Now, what do all of you think a reasonable turnaround might be for peer review? So an example of a short turnaround I submit on July 31st, and my article is published on August 8th. That's 8 days until it's published from my first submission. That seems pretty short to me. So I want you guys in the chat, give me an indication of what you think a reasonable peer review and publication turnaround might be. How many days, weeks, or months do you think it might take from the time you submit an article to the time it's published? All right, I'm seeing at least a month, a couple months, 6 months. All of you are correct. Couple of months. I've had articles under review for over a year, and I've had articles under review for 4 or 5 months, right? It depends, but 8 days is totally unheard of. So be careful. If you are speaking with an editor or speaking with journal staff and they're saying, hey, we're going to turn this around in no time, that is absolutely always a red flag. All right, next one. Is the journal more than 2 to 3 years old? Academic journals should have some history. Now, granted, new journals do come out every week, right? But that doesn't mean, and being a young journal does not mean that it's a predatory journal. But good journals tend to have a long and storied history. So if you're seeing a journal that is really young, and maybe some of these other red flags are coming up on your radar, you're going to want to be extra careful. All right, let's go on to the next one. Are there publication fees? Let me ask you guys something. Should you ever pay to publish your own research? Go ahead and give me your answer in the chat. Should you ever pay to publish your own research? Betsy says, hard no. All right, we got Allison. That feels icky. Raj says no. Anyone else? Soon. All right. Soon I should pay. Perhaps open access. Okay, Denise is saying open access. All right. This is where things get a little tricky. All right. Because many of these predatory journals are open access. They publish the articles under a Creative Commons license. And they charge the author for publication fees. This is essentially to pay for overhead, to pay for processes, administration, and so on. But I want to say that just because a journal charges publication fees does not necessarily mean that it's predatory. For example, the Journal of Medical Internet Research charges up to $3,000 to publish an article with them. However, the Journal of Medical Internet Research is the highest cited and perhaps one of the most respected journals on medical informatics in the world. But they are truly open access. And a high open access fee of over $1,000, typically $1,500 or greater, is common with a legitimate publisher. So if you're getting hit with an open access fee of $300, $500, you need to be careful. It's fine if you want to support open science and open access. That's great. And your article will probably get cited more than if you publish in a journal that does not publish your article as open access. However, you need to be careful about how much you're paying. Again, this is a heuristic. It's a rule of thumb. It's not always true. But if you're seeing $100 article processing fee, you're going to need to dig a little bit deeper. All right. Here's the next one. Are citation metrics or any metrics whatsoever published on the journal's website? And does that journal have any highly cited articles? The second question is kind of a derivation of the first. So we want to know, are they telling you what their impact factor is? Are they telling you what their highest cited journal articles are? If they're not, and if you can't find metrics anywhere, that can be a red flag. At the same time, a red flag can be when you load up that web page and the very first thing that you see is 1.7 impact factor. And then in smaller print underneath that, for example, is the journal's name, right? So they're using these metrics to kind of make you think that they're high quality or high impact or what have you. That's another one where you need to be careful. So it's not just, are the metrics published? If they're not, that's a problem. But also, are the metrics being used in a way that allows you to make an informed decision about the journal, or are they being used in a way that's more manipulative and more marketing? But wait, there's more. Are they writing you and saying, hey, I'm in the field of underwater machine gun loading and basket weaving, and we would like to invite you to submit an article to our esteemed journal because we understand you're an expert in the field. This happens all the time. I get emails every week. Apparently, I am a neuroscientist. I also work in apparently something to do with natology and pediatrics. I didn't know. And apparently they didn't either. And the reason that you'll end up getting these kind of spam emails is because these publishers will kind of crawl through conference proceedings. They'll crawl through other websites where they can find titles, abstracts, and emails. And they'll use that to create a spam list. And they will spam thousands and thousands of emails to try to trick people into submitting something to their journal, whether or not it has anything to do with their field. And it was on that basis that I sent out my angry Facebook post about we need to prepare the next generation for this. Because who wants to have their inbox filled with this kind of garbage, right? And indeed, if a journal is soliciting, if they're writing you and saying, hey, I want you to submit an article to my journal, typically it's the other way around. You, as the young and upcoming scholar, should be soliciting the journal and saying, hey, I want you to publish my article. And then they will consider your article. It's usually not a publisher looking for submissions, although there is an exception to that rule. All right, and on that note, I've given you guys plenty of ideas. I asked you to take notes. Now I want to see the vote. Let's get the vote. Bring the vote in. Okay, guys. Is it A, the International Journal of Education? Is this our non-predatory journal? Is it B, the International Journal of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences? Is it C, the International Journal of Business and Management Studies? Or is it D, the International Journal of Higher Education? Let's all get our votes in, use the chat, and simply input A, B, C, or D.
They're all out there right now doing their research. They're looking up those journals. They're trying to see what those home pages say.
That's what I want to hear. All right, we got A. All right, so I'm going to do a countdown. I want to get your votes in 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, not everyone has had a chance to vote. That's okay if you're shy. So we've got one person saying it's the International Journal of Education. We've got another person saying it's the International Journal of Business and Management Studies. We've got a couple of folks saying it's D, the International Journal of Higher Education. Another vote just came in, hot off the wire. A, so much pressure, is the International Journal of Education. Okay, I'm going to give a drum roll. It's a mental drum roll. I can't play drums. It's D. It's the International Journal of Higher Education. But you wouldn't know that simply by looking at the titles, would you? Because each one of the titles has the word international in it, and that is immediately a red flag. I went to each one of these journals' websites and I looked at all of the criteria, and the heuristics, the rules of thumb that I just gave you. Those are the things that I was ticking off as I went through those websites and I thought about, how would I evaluate this? How would I communicate to a new researcher what to look for? And those were the things that I came up with. Now there is another site, and I provided a link to it at the end of this presentation. I'll give you guys the link to the presentation when I'm done, which has 25 criteria that you can use to kind of tick through all of these. But guess what? There is a single criteria that you can use that in almost 100% of the cases will tell you whether a journal is predatory or not, whether a journal is reputable or not. And that, as Dr. Paul Kirchner from the University of Twente in the Netherlands pointed out to me on my Facebook rant, reputable journals don't solicit. That is, as I mentioned before, if you get an email from a journal saying, please submit to International Journal of Trash Research, chances are that's trash research. However, there is one exception: special issues. Oftentimes, a reputable journal will create a special issue. And because they've created a special issue, it's a topical issue that focuses on a single aspect, right? Because of that, they want to get the word out because they want to get people to submit articles that are directly related to that one topic. So it's a little bit more difficult than the more general call that a journal might have. So a journal of educational technology like Tech Trends, for example, that's generally focused on practitioner-related issues in the field of educational technology, right? But a special issue is going to focus on a single aspect within that broader frame. So here, they're looking at human-computer interaction for ambient intelligence, and the journal is Sensors. And Sensors is actually a really good journal with a great impact factor, and it's well respected, and it's got a great peer review process. So this is the one exception to the rule. But if you get an email that says, hey, please submit to our journal, whether it's International Journal or what have you, chances are that that is not a reputable journal. All right, just checking the chat. And I don't see any questions so far, but if you guys do have questions, know that I've got that open over here and I'm fielding any questions that you got. So let's talk about what is a predatory journal. So I've kind of given you all the scary details here. Let's talk a little bit about what this is specifically. So the term predatory journal came to us from the hero Jeffrey Beal, who is a librarian at the University of Colorado. And he pointed out around 2008 that there were many journals that were being published that were charging publishing fees and that were not particularly rigorous and not particularly high quality. And he started to analyze these different publishers, and he came up with a list of these publishers that he then published online. And this list actually became fairly controversial, and he had to take it down because he was being threatened by, in some cases, legitimate publishers who had ended up on his list and felt that it was unfair the way that he was defining predatory journals because it was getting some false positives, right, and ending up on his list. But he was also getting threats of lawsuits from some of these predatory journals who may or may not have had, great resources to throw at lawyers to make a librarian go away. But thanks to him, the attention and our collective consciousness has grown around this idea of predatory journals. So thank you, Jeffrey Beal. Now, in terms of a definition, an article was published in Nature that specifically sought to define what a predatory journal is. And I'll read this to you. Predatory journals and publishers are entities that prioritize self-interest at the expense of scholarship and are characterized by false or misleading information, deviation from best editorial and publication practices, a lack of transparency, and or the use of aggressive and indiscriminate solicitation practices. So these are kind of the 4 criteria or the 4 areas that define predatory journals. Now, how do they prioritize self-interest at the expense of scholarship? Well, there's a couple of ways that you can interpret it, but self-interest in many ways is about financial gain. And so many of these predatory journals are profit houses. False or misleading information. They may publish false or misleading information. They may provide false or misleading information about their publication, about the journal that they have. Deviation from best editorial and publication practices. I already pointed out that extremely short peer review processes or timelines from submission of an article to an article being published, that's one deviation. Another deviation would be very light peer reviews or having people reviewing work that they really have no business reviewing. A lack of transparency. You might recall I said that good journals are going to publish the metrics for their journal on their site. For example, we have a good impact factor. Impact factor is one way that you can determine if a journal gets cited frequently, and journals that get cited frequently tend to be more respected. If you don't have that information on your site, well, that would not be particularly transparent. And the use of aggressive and indiscriminate solicitation practices, well, that would be, for example, spamming thousands and thousands of emails a day to try to get young and naive scholars to submit and get some lines on their curriculum vitae. So how did we get here? Well, there is a legitimate movement to publish scientific research as open access using Creative Commons licensing. And this allows for greater reach and greater transparency, both in the peer review process all the way through to providing articles that are funded by, in most cases, the public through grant funding, and not hiding those behind a publisher, right? So there's definitely a move towards that and a move towards open science and being just more transparent about the entire process. And this leads to better science and more trustworthy science and more rigorous processes. And we can see what's interesting is for some of these open access, open science journals, we can actually go in and see what the peer reviewers had to say about these articles and how the articles were then changed based on the peer reviews. Right? So that is a legitimate movement towards more open models of publishing science. However, this has also been hijacked because these predatory journals are using open access almost as a marketing tactic to say, hey, we'll get your article published quickly online and we'll put it out there as open access, in some ways undermining this open access movement. Publishers realize that it's really easy to publish something online only. So older journals tend to have had a history of publishing on dead trees or paper, right? And if you go into the journal section in your library, there are actual paper journals that you can thumb through and read in that way, right? But these open access predatory journals are typically online only. Now, again, that's not always a red flag, but it is very easy to publish something online. And it is less costly than publishing something that is in paper or print form. And as I think that many of you have probably cued into already, these I keep wanting to say open access. That's not what I mean to say. These predatory publishers exploit the naivety of young scholars who may not know a whole lot about the field. And I'm looking right now at a note in the chat that says, "Thank goodness I've researched before, but I wasn't completely sure." I may have mischaracterized that, and my apologies. But essentially, it's very difficult to know all the journals in your field, and it's easy for one to slip through the cracks. There's also this idea of scientific rigor theater. At least that's what I call it. It's peer review, but it's not peer review. You put something through kind of a fake peer review process or a very not rigorous process where it's fast and you get your results quickly, and those results don't actually lead to more rigorous or improved research. Instead, it just gives it the veneer of rigor and quality. So I'm going to label that as theater. And then the last issue is some of these journals actually will hijack the look and feel of legitimate journals and try to make their journal sound like the legitimate journal's name. Or they will even create like a fake web page that looks exactly like the legitimate journal's web page. And this is all so that they can get these fake open access publishing fees. So this is how we got to where we're at. And these predatory journals, these predatory publishers, they are scammy on 6 levels. So I'm citing Kobe and colleagues, where they found that along the dimensions of operations, the articles that are published, the editorial and the peer review process, how these journals communicate with their constituents, these processing fees, all of this is just scammy and icky, I believe was a word that I saw in the chat. They're described as deceptive and lacking transparency, and these are going to harken back to that Nature article that I linked off to earlier. But they're deceptive and lacking in transparency, where you've got editorial boards who have no real expertise, i.e., no business being in this field. People who do not have professional credentials, for example, or people who might like have business degrees working in something like, I don't know, paleontology, just to kind of grab something out of thin air. And if you try to look up information about editorial boards, you may not even be able to find any information about who the actual editors are. I've already talked a lot about the quality standards with the poor quality peer review, guarantees of something being published, these short publication times. And then, of course, this all kind of comes down to questionable ethics, and whether that be related to research or publication. So really trying to convince people using very kind of like pushy sales tactics almost to get people to submit to their journal, follow up, aggressive emails, and so on. And then as soon as something's submitted, you receive an invoice saying, "Pay us now," right? We've got your article. If you want to get this published, pay us $300 or what have you. So how do we avoid this tragedy? Well, here's a really easy resource for all of you that I would recommend you check out. It's this thinkchecksubmit.org. It's a user-friendly site that has lots of cool heuristics that you can use, and checklists and so on, and links and other resources that can help you make an informed decision about a journal. And now, for the most part of my talk, I've been talking about how you can avoid submitting to one of these journals. But at the same time, you need to be careful about citing these journals as well. Don't feed the trolls. If you are citing these journals, then these journals will continue to live. There's a question in the chat about, is there a lifespan for a predatory journal before it dies? And I don't have an answer to that question. But what I can say is, some of these rogue publishers and predatory publishers that have hundreds of journals underneath their publishing house continue to lumber on and publish wantonly. And I don't see any signs of them going anywhere. The only way that we can avoid submitting or citing is to raise awareness. And so that's kind of what I'm trying to do. And that's what the folks at thinkchecksubmit.org are also trying to do. So I'm going to tell you a story now. You have to be vigilant. And that's because journals that today are not predatory can become predatory over time. So what does that mean? Well, I'm gonna give you an insight into my inbox. So we are looking for the right place to submit a journal article. And it's in the area of health informatics. We're not we're educational technologists and learning experience designers. We're not doctors and nurses. We don't work in healthcare on that level. So we're not particularly familiar with the journals that exist in that world. So, we went shopping for a journal, and we knew through a friend, one of the journal editors of a particular journal, and so we submitted an article there. And shortly thereafter, I get the email that you see on the screen right now in my inbox. This is IGERPH is the journal. That's the acronym. It's Open Access Journal in MDPI. And MDPI, I learned later, is one of those publishers that is listed on Beall's list of predatory publishers. And so my hackles were raised. And so this was my response to my colleague who sent me that. So as you can see, clearly I was enamored of the journal. And so we sent this email to the editor, who is a young guest editor who is in, I believe, a postdoctoral fellow position. Thanks for all the information and support you provided regarding our submission. Unfortunately, we're going to withdraw it because we found it on Beall's list. In fact, and this is what got us. When we submitted the article, the first thing they wanted from us was guarantee of payment when it was published. They didn't say if, they said when. And we found that to be unscrupulous, and we didn't want to be associated with that. And so we were very kind because we knew this person through a colleague, but we also wanted to be careful. Now here's the response. Shock. I'm deeply sorry. I understand your decision. I appreciate you sharing it with me, and I apologize. I'm sorry for the loss of time and effort. This person didn't realize, particularly the second paragraph, didn't realize the controversies, but I checked out Beall's list, and hey, there it was. I would probably have not agreed to edit their special issue if I had known about these issues. So it goes on to say I'm going to talk to my people and see if I should continue. And here's the fallout. This was a couple weeks later. He followed up with us. And what ended up happening is he said the quality of the peer review process and editorial decisions, although this journal did previously have a fairly good reputation, the quality had consistently been going down. And so he told the editorial office that he'd like to withdraw his editorship of the special issue. That's a big deal. And then, of course, he goes on to apologize for us, and we felt very horrible for him as well because we weren't the only ones who were duped. He was also duped, and he spent a great deal of time and effort pulling together a proposal for a special issue, pulling together the authors who were going to submit. He even had articles being submitted and coming in that were getting ready to go out into peer review. He put in a great deal of effort and time. So I think that this speaks to that editor's integrity, that he was able to pull out and say, I don't want anything to do with this. So hats off to the editor who did that. And it's on that note I'm going to provide you guys some final words. So the first thing is, the peer review process and the scientific publishing process has been built on centuries of trust in that process and in understanding that it's not perfect, but it's the best that we can do so far. but you can't blindly trust. You must verify. And so the resources I've provided today, the heuristics I've provided today, these are things that you can use to verify these different, if you run into an article or you run into a journal, to determine whether or not it is predatory. And if after that you still have questions, don't forget that you have really smart people who you can go to, such as your professors. Also, you need to know your field. I'm sure that you're being told this already by Dr. York, but you need to gain a fairly robust and comprehensive understanding of what journals are prominent in your field. When I think about the field of educational technology and instructional design, I immediately think about Tech Trends, educational technology research and development, Journal of, I could go on. I don't want to list them all out. And if you don't know what journals are highly cited in your field, you can go to Google Scholar and you can find the top journals in your field. It will list out the top journals in educational technology. The next is, and I think that the cautionary tale I provided before would support this, you need to tread carefully in unfamiliar fields. Educational technology and instructional design are connective sciences. That is, we tend to operate outside of our field quite a bit. So you might find yourself working in veterinary medicine or nuclear engineering or working in autism. You may not be particularly familiar with the content or the subject matter or the journals in those fields. And so you need to be very careful. You have the tools at your disposal now in order to determine whether journals that are outside of your field are potentially predatory or not. But be careful. Even journals that seem very legit may not be. I mentioned this already, but if it's cheap, it costs too much. If you've got a very low open access fee, chances are that that's a red flag. Now, I'll say that I've published in other open access journals where they offer discounts, right? If you don't have grant funding, for example, they'll throw you 40, 50, 60% discount on their open access publishing fee because they expect that, big deal researchers probably have some budget to support their publication, right? And so you may be able to get off with a $600, $500 publication fee, but that's an exception, right? The published publication fee is usually going to be over $1,000. So if you're looking at anything below that, tread carefully. And finally, I think you learned it from me, but it can happen to anyone. Not only did I give you a cautionary tale of something that happened to me, I also have evidence that, I've published 3 book chapters in a rogue publisher. And so I know many people in my field who have also published with that same publisher. It's not uncommon. So it can happen to anyone. You got to be careful. You got to be vigilant. And on that note, I'm going to leave you all with some links for further reading, and I'm going to share the presentation with Dr. York so that she can send that out to all of you. And I can probably just pop a link into the chat now as well. So on that note, I'm going to conclude the talk, and microphones are open and the chat is open for any questions.